This is the second part of our lecture series on the historical antecedents of science and technology. So let us begin with the scientific and technological contributions of the ancient Greeks. This is a map of the ancient Greece. It is believed that the ancient Greeks were exposed to the culture and ideas of Egypt and Mesopotamia because of trading. So, building on Egyptian and Mesopotamian knowledge, the Greeks flourished in various disciplines such as philosophy, mathematics, and science. In fact, the achievements of ancient Greek science were among the finest in antiquity. However, besides its great achievements, Greek science had its flaws because observation was undervalued by the Greeks in favor of the deductive process, where knowledge is built by means of pure thought. So the Greeks put such an emphasis on deduction that they falsely believed that it was the only way to obtain the highest knowledge. Let's dig a little deeper on the process of deduction and its impact on the scientific ideas of the Greeks. In Greeks' deductive reasoning, knowledge is built by means of pure thought. This approach proved to be powerful, and its success in mathematics encouraged its application in many other disciplines. The Greeks eventually came to believe that the only acceptable way of obtaining knowledge was the use of deduction. For them, the starting point to discover principles was always an idea in the mind of the philosopher. And sometimes observations were undervalued, and some other times the Greeks were not able to make a sharp distinction between empirical observations and logical arguments. But as we will learn in the succeeding lessons, this way of doing science had serious limitations, and modern scientific method no longer relies on this technique because today science seeks to discover principles based on observations as a starting point. In the next slides, we will consider the ideas of noteworthy Greeks, most of whom relied on deduction. This is a bust of Pythagoras of Samos, who I believe is familiar to you. It was Pythagoras who started the idea of a numerical system and therefore the beginning of mathematics. He was also the first to propose that the square of the hypotenuse is equivalent to the sum of the squares of the opposite two sides, which is known as the Pythagorean theorem. Aside from the Pythagorean theorem, he was also credited with other scientific discoveries, including the sphericity of the Earth. So, Pythagoras was the first person to suggest that the Earth was a sphere, but it is not clear what led him to that conclusion. He was also the first person to perceive that the morning and evening star is actually the same planet, and that is Venus. Pythagoras also founded a sect where Greek philosophy, religion, art, and mysticism were all fused together. In ancient times, Greeks did not make a clear distinction between science and non-scientific disciplines, and there is a widespread argument which states that the coexistence of Greek art, philosophy, mysticism, and other non-scientific disciplines interacting together with science has interfered with the development of scientific ideas. But there are also those who argue that non-scientific disciplines have, in fact, enhanced the imagination of the human mind and provided the motivation for scientific progress. This is Plato. He was a student of Socrates, and he established the academy in Athens, thought to be the world's first college. Plato believed all substances to be composed of air, earth, fire, and water. These old elements are reflective of what we now call the states of matter. He also believed in a spherical earth, which was the center of his universe, and a motion of planets along crystalline spheres. Plato also invented a theory of vision involving three streams of light, one from what is being seen, one from the eyes, and one from the illuminating source. This is Hippocrates, who was credited by historians with moving the subject of medicine away from the previously supernatural and religious approach. Probably you are familiar with the Hippocratic Oath. In ancient times, medical practitioners swore with the Hippocratic Oath not to administer poison, not to abuse patients in any way, and not to break the confidentiality between patients and doctor. Today, modern day version of the Hippocratic Oath is still sworn by many medical students around the world. So what made Hippocrates outstanding? First, he established a medical school on the island of Kos, and he also wrote many treatises on medical matters. And through his systematic and empirical investigation of the disease and remedies, he is credited with being the founder of modern medicine. With his more scientific approach in medicine, the Greeks gradually got away from their old belief that illness is a divine punishment. Aristotle is one of the most well-known figures in the history of ancient Greece. He was a popular student of famous Greek philosopher Plato. But unlike Plato, Aristotle displayed an instinct to use scientific and factual reasoning in his study of nature rather than pure philosophical thoughts. Some of his most important contributions include his attempt to classify living beings. In his book entitled Historia Animalium, or History of Animals, Aristotle was the first person in human history to venture into the classification of different animals. He used traits that are common among certain animals to classify them into similar groups. Aristotle also wrote a number of treatises that primarily involved the animal kingdom, earning him the title the father of zoology. He also devised the binomial nomenclature. Using this system, all living organisms could be given two different sets of names, defined as the organism's genus and difference. Aristotle meant the genus of a living being to represent its collective family or group as a whole. The difference, on the other hand, is what makes the living organism different from other members of the family it falls within. Aristotle also wrote a number of treatises that influenced other fields of science. He was the first to write a book that dealt with the specifics of psychology, known as De Anima, or On the Soul. In this book, he proposed the idea of abstraction that reigns over the body and mind of a human being. In his treatise known as Meteorologica, Aristotle was able to put forth a very detailed analysis of the world around him. He covered the different aspects and phenomena of air, water, and earth. He categorized thunder, lightning, rainbows, meteors, and comets as different atmospheric phenomena. So those were just a few of the Greeks that contributed in the growth of science that influenced the world. The ancient Greeks in general are often credited with building the foundations upon which all Western cultures are built, and this impressive accolade stems from their innovative contributions to a wide range of human activities, such as in sports, in medicine, architecture, even in democracy. In the succeeding slides, let us examine a number of technological contributions of the ancient Greeks. But I want to remind you that, like any other culture, the Greeks learned from the past. So they adopted good ideas that they came across when they met other cultures and they developed their own brand new ideas. This is the magnificent temple on the Acropolis of Athens, known as the Parthenon. It was built in the 5th century BCE and it was dedicated to the city's patron deity, Athena. This is the biggest and probably most famous among Greek temples and architecture. Some of the features of Greek architecture are still used in a number of theaters, courthouses, and government buildings across the globe. In fact, there are so many buildings patterned on the Greek infrastructure. And these are just two of the Greek inspired buildings in the Philippines. These two showcase the columns that adorn facades, which I think is the most common and most popular feature of Greek architecture. Now, moving on, this is a depiction of an old crane. Since we are looking into the Greek architecture, it is also important to mention that the Greeks invented the first crane to help move heavy loads or heavy objects. Although some people may think that the crane began in Egypt due to all the major construction that happened there, but archaeological studies have found that the crane dates back to the 6th century in Greece. This is another modern-day replication of a watermill, one of the inventions of the Greeks. They invented the watermill around 500 BCE in order to harness the power of the moving water. This is called the Antikythera mechanism, one of the biggest unsung inventions from ancient Greek technology. This was used to predict astrological events such as eclipses. It was also useful in helping form calendars. The mechanism helped the Greeks to keep track of years. It properly tracked the 4-year cycle of the original Olympic Games, known as the Olympiad. Modern day scholars recognized that technically this was the first analog computer. Now let's move on to the ancient Roman science and technology. The Romans assimilated earlier Greek science for their own purposes. Roman innovations were largely more concerned with refinements rather than new ideas. But unlike the Greeks, who mostly taught their ideas orally or through word of mouth, the Romans managed to document and record their scientific thoughts, preserving it for posterity. Another distinction is that, for the practical Roman mind, science had to provide useful information. They were not fond of long discussion on purely theoretical level. Science has to be of practical use. For example, physics had to be of practical use to produce effective torsion catapults. Biology must improve agricultural yields. And mathematics and geometry must combine in order to provide the best answers to build the most impressive domes and arches. In the succeeding slides, we will look into a number of Roman authors who stood out in their study of earlier Greek science and in their attempt to forge this body of knowledge with some new discoveries and theories into a corpus of practically useful ideas suitable for the Roman way of life. One of the most famous Roman authors was Cato, also a famous orator who wrote a valuable treatise entitled De Agricultura, which gave advice on how to run a good estate with notes on wine and oil production and other various remedies for crop diseases. This is a bust of Lucretius, who was a Roman poet and philosopher who wrote De Rerum Natura, which means on the nature of things. It was an epic poem, widely regarded as one of the most influential works in the history of literature, philosophy, and science. In this poem, he wrote about diverse things such as atoms and the void, our modes of perception, and our will. He also discussed the origin of the world and life, the causes of earthquakes, and he reflected on art, language, science, and religion. The poem also talked about a variety of diverse scientific topics such as cosmology, mental illness, nutrition, clouds, even seasons and eclipses. Other Roman authors like Nigidius, Vitruvius, Seneca, and Marcus Malilius also wrote significant works in various scientific disciplines, which formed the foundation of Roman science and technology. Let us now look into the technological breakthroughs of the ancient Romans. So the Romans adopted the Greek architectural orders and they made their buildings much more intricately decorative. New types of buildings appeared, such as shown in the picture: monumental aqueducts, basilica, triumphal arch, amphitheater, and granary buildings were also built. The Romans also adopted much of what the Greeks and Ptolemaic Egypt had achieved previously in the field of astronomy. Measuring time using sundials did become more accurate in the Roman period when even portable sundials become popular, such as this, shown in the picture. A 7-day astrological week was also adopted during the reign of Augustus, and Roman astronomy was also intertwined with astrology. The Roman emperors used astrology as one means of justifying their rule. For example, the first emperor, Augustus, claimed that his elevation was foretold by his horoscope, and he even used his sign, which is Capricorn, on his coins, as shown in this picture. So astrology remained important in the Roman world until the collapse of the Western Empire in the 5th century CE. The ancient Romans also developed farming tools such as the wheeled plow and oxen-driven harvesting machine shown in this slide. This dramatically improved farming efficiency. So the Romans were also well aware of the importance of climate, soil type, and land formation in ensuring the best production results. And techniques familiar to the 19th century CE European farmers were also used effectively by the Romans, such as crop rotation, pruning, grafting, seed selection, drainage, irrigation, and manuring. Now, perhaps the greatest contribution of the Romans was in the field of medicine, and it was to spread knowledge of medical matters through the publication of treatises, just like this Roman encyclopedia known as the De Medicina, which was compiled by Aulus Cornelius Celsus. He examined medical science and compiled information on topics such as diet, therapy, and surgery. Now, the second picture is compositones or prescriptions, a handbook of medical remedies especially useful for gladiators. And this was compiled by Scribonius Largus. And these are just two of the treatises in the field of medicine that were produced by the Romans.